The pickup at the end of the gravel road looked abandoned. It sat alone at the Sioux Hustler trailhead in northern Minnesota, dusted with pine needles, New Mexico plates streaked with dirt. When a conservation officer finally checked it, the woods were quiet, the cab was empty, and the engine was cold. Whoever had driven it toward the Boundary Waters had vanished into the trees and not come back. The registration led to 29-year-old Jordan Michael Grider from Moriarty, New Mexico. When officers reached his family, they learned this was not an ordinary missing camper. Jordan had spent much of the last decade living outside, drifting between the hills of Kentucky and forests in upstate New York. He hiked long trails, slept in a hammock, and took temporary work only when he needed cash. Recently, he had set his mind on a new test, spending a full winter alone in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. In late September 2018, Jordan had been at home celebrating his birthday with his parents and 5 brothers. He talked about driving north, about the lakes and deep woods he had studied on maps. He told them he would park at the Sioux Hustler Trail, hike several miles in, and set up a long-term camp. He gave them a general description of where he planned to be and promised to send photos once he was settled. Around October 9th, he reached the trailhead, parked the truck, loaded his tent, hammock, winter clothing, food, and tools, and walked into the forest. There was no satellite communicator, no locator beacon, and no partner. Once he stepped off the trail, the only trace he left in civilization was the truck sitting at the end of the gravel road. When authorities first noted the pickup on October 22nd, officers with the U.S. Forest Service and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources already knew a man from New Mexico planned to winter in the woods. They tried to locate his camp and couldn't. The forest beyond the trail broke into bogs, rock, and thick stands of trees. For a time, there was no reason to assume anything was wrong. Through the fall, Jordan sent his family a few messages and photographs from his campsite, standing bundled in layers among trees and early ice. He told them he was okay and roughly where he was. Then the contact stopped. The Boundary Waters sank into deep winter. Temperatures dropped well below zero, winds swept across frozen lakes, and daylight shrank to a narrow band of gray. At home, the silence stretched from weeks into months. It was not unusual for Jordan to be hard to reach, but the complete lack of news, paired with the truck that never moved, pushed concern into something more serious. By early 2019, the family's worries had become a formal welfare check. Officers confirmed his pickup was still at the trailhead. Nobody in nearby towns had seen him come in for supplies. In April, as snow began to pull back from the forest floor, U.S. Forest Service officers went back to the Sioux Hustler area and pushed deeper into the trees, looking for any sign of a long-term camp. About a mile and a half from the trailhead, in dense woods away from marked paths, they found one. A tent still stood, weathered but upright. A hammock was strung between trees. Firewood was stacked. Cooking gear and supplies were scattered around the site. At first glance, it looked like the camp of someone who knew how to live outside for months. Then they looked inside the shelter and at the hammock. There was a broad, dark stain on the hammock fabric. Inside the tent, blood soaked into gear and pooled where someone's head and upper body would have been. The snowmelt had softened edges, but the volume was obvious. This was not a minor injury. Yet there was no body, no fresh footprints, no drag marks, and no clear sign that another person had been there. In that quiet clearing, the campsite felt like the scene of a disaster with its central figure missing. Evidence at the site linked the camp to Jordan. The St. Louis County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation, joining with the County Rescue Squad, the U.S. Forest Service, and agents from the U.S. Border Patrol. They set up a search around the campsite and began combing the surrounding forest on foot. The terrain was uneven and cluttered with blowdowns and brush. Searchers worked outward from the tent in grids, eyes on the ground for clothing, gear, or remains. On April 25, 2019, they began to find bones scattered on the forest floor. They were not clustered in one spot, but spread out over a wide area under leaves and debris. Some were partially buried, others lay exposed. There were no intact layers of clothing holding everything together. Months of weather and scavenging animals had changed whatever scene had once been there into fragments. Investigators treated the area as a potential crime scene. Each bone was flagged, photographed, and collected. In public statements, officials described them as possible human remains, found near a campsite believed to belong to a missing New Mexico man. Privately, they understood that the search for a living camper was over. Because of the condition of the remains, the sheriff's office turned to a forensic anthropologist. Testing confirmed that the bones were human. DNA and other work then tied them to Jordan's family. By May 2019, news outlets reported that human remains had been found at the bloody camp and were connected to the missing camper. The final, formal conclusion came later. On August 20, 2020, the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office publicly announced that the skeletal remains recovered near the Sioux Hustler Trail were those of Jordan M. Grider. The statement added two key points. The exact cause of death could not be determined, and foul play was not suspected. Investigators had found no evidence of another person attacking him, no bullet casings or obvious signs of an assault. Whatever killed him had left very little that could be read on bone. With no clear cause of death, investigators and readers are left with informed guesses. The blood in the hammock and tent points to a major injury in camp from an accident or sudden medical event. Alone in deep winter, even a single bad fall or deep cut could have left Jordan disoriented and unable to save himself. After he died, wolves, bears, and smaller scavengers could have fed on his body and scattered his remains long before searchers arrived. For his family, those ideas do little to answer the questions they live with. They knew his experience level and how deliberately he had chosen this path. He was not a lost tourist. He was someone who had built his identity around surviving in places most people avoided. They also understood that the conditions he sought out can be unforgiving. In sub-zero cold, the margin for error narrows to almost nothing. One mistake can be enough. In the end, what can be said with confidence is stark and limited. A young man drove north in October 2018 to spend a winter alone in one of the most demanding environments in the continental United States. He set up a camp, sent a few images home, and then fell silent. Months later, officers acting on his family's fears found his campsite soaked in blood and empty. Nearby, they recovered scattered skeletal remains that were later identified as his. No evidence of a human attacker was found. The exact way he died remains unknown. Today, hikers still walk the Sioux Hustler Trail, most of them unaware that, not far beyond the trees, a man once tried to make that wilderness his winter home and never walked back out. In official files, the case is closed. For the people who loved him, and for those who have studied his story, it remains an unsettling reminder of how quickly even a skilled outdoorsman can be overtaken by the place he thought he understood. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.